Hi, this is REAPSO Video. I'm Theodore Ross, the editor-in-chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network. Today, we're talking about our newest episode of REAPSO, which is called Fertilizer's Toxic Journey, which I think you can tell what that's about. But we're going to talk a lot more about it. I'm joined today by one of two reporters on the podcast. The other is Eric Schmid, and this is Garrett Hazelwood, who is an investigative journalist living in New Orleans. Garrett, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So before we jump in, I just want to mention that this podcast episode on REAPSO is done in partnership with our good friends at WWNO's Sea Change podcast, which you should all check out and you should all be fans of and you should all download and do all the good things. So shout out to Carlisle Calhoun, the host there, and our good friend. And I think I hit all the good spots. Yes?
Yeah, I think that covers it.
All right. So this is a really interesting story about a very, I think in a way, overlooked form of chemical toxicity, and it's fertilizers. And I think the reason it's overlooked is because it's so basic to the, no pun intended, so basic to the way we grow food at scale in this country. But the dangers are real. Communities are getting broken by the way we use fertilizers. Our rivers are being polluted. All kinds of unfortunate things happen. You don't often think of good things when you say the phrase Cancer Alley. So, Garrett, tell me, with all of that as the context, why this story?
I think one of the things that we were trying to capture is just both the scale and how widely distributed this winds up being. So, I mean, you have these facilities that are making it in Cancer Alley down here in Louisiana.
Why don't you tell everybody what Cancer Alley is? I use the phrase, but you should tell people what it is.
Right. Yeah. So Cancer Alley is a strip of the Mississippi River that's between Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and it's a chemical corridor. So on what's former plantation lands, there have been built all of these giant industrial facilities that are mostly oil and gas and making a lot of fertilizer. It's actually the area where more fertilizer is made than anywhere else in the United States and possibly North America, with the exception of there's a certain kind of like phosphorus fertilizer that comes from Canada in large quantities. But this is pretty much the epicenter for this part of the world of fertilizer production.
Yeah, so you were saying about Cancer Alley and why this story, when I so rudely interrupted you, but go ahead.
Well, yeah, and so they're making it there. They're sending it across the country in pipelines, on ships, on trains, and trucks, and it's all going through the Mississippi Basin, and it's coming back into the Mississippi River and winding up in the Gulf of Mexico. And so you're having like point pollution where they're making it. You're having it like pollute all the areas where it's applied onto farm fields. And then it's coming back down through the waterways and polluting all these areas. And so, yeah, we wanted to try and capture the scale of the problem and the way that it is spread out so widely and is really, I think when a lot of people think about, you don't think about chemicals and food together as like this thing that is so deeply tied together. And it's also really an oil and gas story, interestingly. Because
in what way?
Well, so much of ammonia fertilizer, which is the most commonly applied chemical or the one that's applied in the biggest numbers, it is made with natural gas. And so these companies are huge buyers of natural gas, and they don't actually have to be. The technology is out there to make this stuff using water as a feedstock instead of natural gas. But it costs a little bit more. And so yeah, it's very tied in with the petrochemical industry.
So as we talk about the why this story, I can tell you as a producer on this and somebody who helped with the production of the episode, the thing that first drew me to it, and I want you to talk about it, is mountain of radioactive sludge.
Yeah, I was also pretty shocked to learn about this and to know that there's several of them an hour from where I live. And so basically they pull all of this ore out of the ground, and it's a little bit interesting. But a place in Florida called Bone Valley is where a lot of this stuff comes from. And it's called that because it was an area where like ancient rivers and waterways were depositing all of this, basically like fossilized remains. Like it's like dinosaur bones essentially, that has turned, like, been mineralized over millions of years and turned into phosphorus. And so they strip mine this stuff out of the ground, and then they bring it to Louisiana to process it. And the waste product, once they pull out what they need, the phosphorus fertilizer, they're left with this radioactive sludge, that they pump into these big piles. The water evaporates off, and it grows and grows and grows. And they've just become massive. And they're right there beside the Mississippi River, where, I mean, we're obviously in an area where hurricanes come through. We're in an area that is sinking. And so there's a lot of dangers just to these stacks that the radioactivity, like, it's in the Earth's crust. So there are these elements that are naturally occurring there, but they get really condensed once they pull out all the stuff that they're trying to harvest. And so, yeah, you have these things that are off gassing, like a radioactive gas called radon, that's quite harmful.
And this is a classic environmental justice story, because we're talking about a place that's, I mean, it is not a stone's throw, a crawfish toss from the French Quarter, basically. And there are people living very, very close to these fertilizer processing plants, right?
Yeah, and I mean, I mentioned that the Cancer Alley, a lot of the industrial facilities are built on former plantation lands. And so some of the folks that I talk to in these communities, I mean, they're descendants of people who were enslaved on those same properties that are now producing this material that is hurting them, and that is destroying the lands that their families have had for generations. And it really is a situation where you have these giant multinational corporations coming in to harvest what they can to, like, leach out the value from this place, and destroying the natural resources here that the people who are living there depend upon. And so, yeah, it's a real extension of a historic injustice that's been happening in that same place for hundreds of years now.
So you talk about multinationals playing a role in this. They're not often that easy to report on, but maybe you have a different answer to this question. But what was the biggest obstacle to your reporting on this story?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was one of the big obstacles is, we couldn't really get a response from either of the companies that we were talking about. There were a lot of also labor issues involved that I would have liked to include, but it was just the scope of the story couldn't quite fit it. And it also, we did face challenges in like just getting hard data on this stuff. But
you mean impact on people working in these plants?
Yeah. And
Okay.
so, because one of the justifications is that these facilities bring jobs to Louisiana and tax dollars to Louisiana. And it looks like the reality of that is that they're way overselling the benefits. And a lot of people at these facilities, at the biggest one that we looked at, most of the people who work there are contractors. And so they're not getting the same salary or benefit that, like, benefits package that full-time employees would get. People in the community told me that a lot of them are, they don't know if they're going to have work the next day or the next week. And so they're strung along as needed. And if anybody, it also becomes a safety issue at these plants too, because people are sort of tenuously employed. They're not as invested in the work. They may not be as knowledgeable about what's going on at the facility. And so these are dangerous chemicals that they're working around. And I spoke to some workers there who had said that since a sort of like anti-union movement has affected the area, and worker protections have been removed, things have gotten less safe for the employees there.
That's not good. I mean, all right, so we're coming towards my last question, but before we do that, we've talked about mountain of radioactive sludge. We talked about Cancer Alley. There's one other phrase that, as a journalist, I'm oftentimes interested in the bad things. I hate to admit that, but it's true. But the third one is, and you should explain it, the dead zone.
Yeah. So the dead zone also is something that I think a lot of people in Louisiana have heard about and are a little bit aware of, but when I really started digging into this, the scale of it is pretty staggering. But essentially, what it is you have fertilizer making its way down the Mississippi River into the Gulf, and when it hits the Gulf, it makes these like tiny little plants grow. So essentially, algae in the water starts to grow, and they die. And as they die, they sink to the bottom and are fed on by bacteria. And that process of the bacteria eating these like dead plant matter, it sucks oxygen out of the water. And so what happens is once a year when the fertilizer loads are the greatest, and it's the time period has been sort of gradually expanding that this is out there, there forms this huge area of water where there's no oxygen in it, or there's very, very little oxygen in it. And nothing can survive there except bacteria, essentially. And so all the little critters that live in the mud, everything that lives within the first, 10 to 20 to even 30 feet of water, of the water column, has to either get out if it can, or it just dies. So, oysters, clams, anything that's on the bottom. I talked to a professor at Louisiana State University in the story, Cassie Glaspie, and she studies I think it's called benthic communities. So she's like a worm scientist, like sea worms.
That's a community, the benthic community? I didn't realize worms were a community. That's good.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what it's called.
Okay.
And yeah, and so she like can really speak eloquently to the richness of life that is down there on the seafloor, and it just gets wiped away. And so there's really this area where everything is dead. And so it's a big problem for fishermen, because fishermen can't obviously fish those waters when nothing's there. They're getting like pushed to the margins more and more. So their fishing grounds are shrinking, and they're having to go to different places, maybe use more fuel to get out past it. Or maybe fish closer to shore, where this fisherman that I spoke to, he can't really dip his nets, because the other thing that fertilizer does is make aquatic plants on top of the water grow in a bigger profusion than they have before. So he can't really dip his nets in the nearshore areas where he's been pushed out to, where his shrimp that he's fishing for have been pushed out to.
That you can see. I mean, I've gone on one of these kayak tours off of Lake Pontchartrain, and you can see the water lilies and the other vegetation choking the waterways. The stuff that's happening at the bottom can go on without our noticing it, but that it's visible. So I'm sure you have a lot to say to this particular last question, but I'm curious what you think is the takeaway from this episode. What should we, if there's one thing, learn from it?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. You were talking about being sort of drawn to the bad things as journalists, and I mean, I think that often I'll put out a story that I've worked on and share it with friends and family, and they'll be like, "Wow, that is depressing." So I do think that this story, while depressing, it's illuminating that one of the things that I took away from it is that a lot of this fertilizer is being used not to grow food, actually, but to make ethanol for corn. And so we're putting ethanol in our fuel, and it's the idea behind that originally was that it would be less carbon intensive. Turns out that's not the case. I think there are some like kind of easy, smaller, maybe easy is the wrong word, but there are like government policies that could happen, and there are practices that farmers could use that would really address this problem. And I think like in service of making a little bit more profit, as farmers must do, it is a business. They have created the conditions that are going to make their own livelihoods a little bit less sustainable in the long run. And so, yeah, I do think that like there are a lot of individual tweaks that people can make that would be personally beneficial and that would benefit the like wider community, not just of people who use these waterways, but other fishermen, other economies that are all interconnected here.
Well, I think that's a good thing to point out about the episode. We've been sort of somewhat jokingly talking about these sort of hyperbolic sounding things that are in the episode, and those are all real and they're all really important. But it's actually a very nuanced episode. If you listen to it, there's time that you spend in Cancer Alley with an African American family that's been on the land there for a long time and that's fighting for its rights, and also dealing with the health consequences of living in this area. When you talk about the dead zone, you're there with a fishing family that's been fishing for generations that may not be able to continue doing it. And the one part that we didn't talk about the most was a farmer that Eric Schmid reports on in Missouri, who's having to make those choices that you're talking about whether or not to use fertilizer at scale and what the financial choices for him are. And I think one of the things that is a takeaway for me is that what he is dealing with, the contradictions and the choices he has to make, are a pretty good rationale for why we have a government, right? You can't rely necessarily on someone acting against their own financial interest to make changes to the environment. You do need the regulatory role of the government. Hate to say it, and that's the thing that's happening right now that is we are moving the most quickly away from, is a regulatory role from the government. So that's concerning. But to hear all of these people's views, and they're not simple. No one that you spoke to or Eric spoke to has an easy and obvious answer. They're not holding up banners saying do this. They all have nuanced points of view, and I really appreciate that about your reporting. I commend you for it.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was an outgrowth of just talking to these people because it is a complicated thing, and I think there's a real conflict between sort of protecting the environment and protecting the resource and functioning in capitalism and functioning in this thing where you've got to turn a profit too. And so there is a lot of contradiction at the heart of the story, I think, that I'm glad you're saying came through.
Well, Garrett, thank you very much for your time and your work. The episode is out there on Reapso right now. You can get it on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or whatever your podcast app of the moment is. And if you want to learn more about FERN's dispatches from the front lines of food, farming, or the environment, you can go to www.thefern.org. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ted. Great talking with you.